Most modern action games are, in some form or another, about empowerment. Get all the abilities you can, level up as high as possible, get all the ammo and guns, and kill everyone who gets in your way with greater and greater ease. It's a fairly reliable formula and a pretty satisfying one because it obviously feels really good to be in power. But at the same time, it's also kind of limiting, which wouldn't really be a problem if it weren't the most ubiquitous design philosophy in all of action gaming. Nearly every action game, from Half-Life to Uncharted to friggin' Too Human to most RPGs, is about how satisfying it is to take out lots of enemies. Games about disempowerment, on the other hand, games about weakness, are either incredibly rare or totally non existent within the action genre. You typically have to play a stealth game or a survival horror title to be put into the shoes of a character who isn't a walking armory, who is a weak person who can die pretty easily. And usually those aren't that satisfying unless you're the kind of person who actually really liked the old Resident Evil games and how horribly they controlled and all that shit. And that bums me out a little bit because disempowerment, weakness, can actually be really damn satisfying in its own right. Take Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, although I'm sure I'm mispronouncing Cthulhu. Before the game suddenly turns into a really bad FPS at its midpoint, it included one of the single coolest levels I've ever experienced in a game ever. You play a private eye who comes to a town full of crazy people and you don't have a gun and you investigate the town for a little while and then you fall asleep. And when you fall asleep in the town hotel, you wake up to find literally the entire town storming the hotel with the intent to kill you for getting too close to the truth, whatever that truth is. Probably has to do with Cthulhu, given the name of the game. And they do have guns and they do have knives and you have nothing. Literally nothing. And as they burst into your hotel room, you've got to run from adjacent room to adjacent room, locking doors behind you as quick as possible, and pushing bookcases in front of doors, and staying away from windows as bullets blast the wood and glass all around you, and your head is filled with the shouts and the moans of these insane villagers, and you feel absolutely terrified, but also incredibly excited just from the pacing of the whole scene, and how it feels to, oh shit, run, okay, I gotta close this door, lock it, push a bookcase in front of it, do I have time? I don't know if I have time, I gotta go, oh god, you actually see them bursting into the room, it's terrifying. And I mean, that's why horror games, quote unquote horror, like Fear 2 don't really work because empowerment generally runs contrary to feeling fear. You can't be scared of a little ghost girl when you're armed with two shotguns and a laser cannon, but you can be scared of a big group of evil villagers when you have literally nothing to your name other than your clothes and the ability to lock doors. That feeling of being completely powerless while an entire town tried to kill me was so aesthetically different from anything I'd encountered in modern action games before that I still remember it to this day. Other games like Penumbra have tried to have similar chase scenes, and though some work better than others, they always work well. You've always got that sort of pulse-pounding horror mixed with the elation of like, holy shit, I'm alive, I'm outrunning these bastards. But as fantastic as scenes like this are, I can count the total number of scenes like this where a powerful force confronts a powerless player on one hand. Conversely, I would need at least 7,000 more hands to count how many times I've killed a huge amount of people who had no power whatsoever. The exact opposite of what I'm just talking about. I mean, Mirror's Edge was actually really good at the powerlessness thing in its demo, even though the main game sort of screwed that up. But I haven't really seen too many mainstream games attempt to tackle that whole idea of powerlessness in a really big way. And not to mention, empowerment as an ideal can be incredibly easy to screw up. It's not just enough to keep giving the player more and more and more and more power, and then just climax with a really big exertion of that power. I mean, think of the ending of BioShock. On paper, it does everything right, and then it represents a culmination of all the plasmids and weapon upgrades you've earned so far, a culmination of all the gameplay mechanics and things you've learned. But in practice, it just felt like more of the same, and thus was really unsatisfying. What's interesting to me is that when people talk about the moments they really enjoyed in Bioshock, those moments usually have something to do with being in a state of relative disempowerment, whether you're talking about fighting a big daddy who is much more powerful than you, or the scene with Andrew Ryan near the last third of the game, which is pretty much the ultimate in disempowerment. The boss fight at the end, that from a gameplay perspective should be super groovy fucking awesome, is actually very low on people's lists of things that they enjoy about Bioshock, even though it's all about empowerment and it is the logical progression of those mechanics, just because it's not really a satisfying kind of climax. I mean, narratively, if we're talking about story-based games, empowerment gameplay often just doesn't make dramatic sense. Basic story structure typically dictates that it's more effective to put the protagonist in a position of incredible loss and seeming hopelessness before they come back and succeed to the point where victory initially seems almost impossible because the character has no power left. I mean, think of the Death Star run in the first Star Wars movie, and how incredibly fucked the rebels seem to be for like 99% of the scene until Han shows up, which is why that scene works so well. It's suspenseful, it's exciting. When the Death Star finally blows up, it's this wonderful release, and it feels great. Now imagine if that entire scene, everything had been the same except when the rebels went in, they went in with superior firepower, armed with the knowledge that they probably were gonna win. I mean, the scene would be boring as fuck, but that's the exact position that most narrative-driven action games put us in. Now, I'm not saying that all games should have identical structures to films, and I'm not saying that they should all adhere to just one structure, period, but ask yourself this: which was more emotionally interesting to you? Killing Fontaine at the end of Bioshock in an orgy of fire and lightning and hate and explosions, or crawling through the microwave corridor as a 60-year-old man on his last legs of life in Metal Gear Solid 4. Now, there are obviously more than a few really satisfying empowerment-heavy climaxes to games, as the super gravity gun from the end of Half-Life 2 will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, but I'd love to see more disempowered player characters in modern action games. Killing a bunch of Goombas who are less powerful than you can be pretty satisfying in a lot of different ways, but it can be equally interesting, if not more so, to feel sort of like one of those Goombas, to be in the complete opposite position. It's just something I'd like to see explored a little more. And that's pretty much it for this week. If you want to send me an email for whatever reason, send it to reverendanthony@gmail.com, and I will talk to you next week.